Environment over convenience. Plastic shopping bags are utilized almost everywhere. They are lightweight, strong, and inexpensive. Customers like them because they make carrying goods so convenient. Stores of all kinds print advertising messages on the bags and give them to customers. Why then are so many countries regulating or even banning their use? Unfortunately, because of these very attributes, plastic bags have an adverse effect on the environment. Their low cost leads to their overuse. For example, environmental groups have estimated that in Taiwan, citizens used to discard 16 million plastic bags a day. Residents of the state of Massachusetts in the United States used more than 2 billion plastic bags per year. Since plastic is made from chemicals found in oil, these single-use bags never break down and decay. When they are thrown away, they last forever, along roads, in ponds, and eventually in the oceans. There is no proven or efficient way to remove plastics once they enter large bodies of water. Some animals that dwell in the sea, such as turtles and dolphins, mistake plastic bags for food. If a bag becomes stuffed down their throats, it can cause fatal suffocation. Thousands of animals choke on the bags every year. Eventually, the plastic fragments may break down into smaller pieces, but they can still be ingested by a wide range of sea animals, from oysters to whales. In this way, microplastics enter the human food chain and cause tragic damage to people's health. Beginning around the year 2000, cities, provinces, and entire countries decided to take action against this form of pollution. At first, municipal governments tried to minimize the use of these bags by requiring stores to charge customers for each one. This reduced the incidence of bags entering the waste stream, yet billions of bags were still being thrown out each day. As the costs of trying to clean the environment rose, more places enacted outright bans on the bags. Now, ecologically conscious people around the world use alternate means of carrying packages. They bring their own reusable bags when they go shopping, pack their purchases in paper bags, recycle the bags in special collection bins, or have their purchases boxed and delivered to their homes in biodegradable packaging.
The Elgin Marbles consists of a parade of beautiful statues of gods and goddesses from Athens, a Greek city named for Athena, the virgin goddess of wisdom and warfare. The statues were sculpted at a time when Athens was flourishing and perhaps the most powerful city in the world. These works of art were once brightly painted and gleamed in the sunshine, but today, 2,500 years later, many of them are broken and have lost their color. The anonymous artists who created them were very skilled in geometry, which is apparent in the sense of balance and harmony that they possess. The statues continue to awe those who come from around the world to view them. Even now, the Elgin Marbles enlighten artists about the creation of beauty. In the 1800s, Lord Elgin visited Athens from England. He was an amateur art lover who was saddened to see that the statues had fallen into decay. He asked the Sultan of Turkey, who then ruled Athens, if he could buy the statues. The Sultan agreed in the hopes of enriching his kingdom. And since he found the statues to be of little importance, he willingly made the concession. Lord Elgin had just attained some of the most important treasures in art history. He brought the Elgin Marbles to England and donated them to the British Museum, where they remain to this day. However, after the Greeks obtained autonomy from Turkey, their leaders complained about the sale. They believed that the Sultan of Turkey never had jurisdiction to sell the statues in the first place, and that the beautiful works of art did not belong in England. Instead, they should be returned to Athens, where indigenous Greeks have always dwelled. However, the British Museum has refused to return the Elgin marbles. They say they will not feed the greed of the Greeks, and that their claims to the statues are ambiguous at best. They believe the British paid for the statues fairly and in compliance with all the laws of the time.
Globalization. Today, it is not at all abnormal for the goods you purchase to come from around the world. Sometimes a single item is comprised of parts constructed in many different countries. This is applicable to almost anything you can buy today. Consider a sweater. The wool may be woven by a robot in China, dyed using artificial colors from India, and sold in the United States. Long ago, the fiscal cost of importing or exporting items from foreign countries was high, and manufacturers considered the practice to be fiscally irresponsible. By contrast, prices were low for goods that were made at home or in adjacent countries. Nowadays, however, the convenience of importing and exporting goods is in large part due to globalization. Globalization means more closely connected countries. Merchants broker deals between entrepreneurs from across the globe to consolidate their costs and configure the lowest prices for their products. Imagine your company wants to start manufacturing bicycles and selling them. If a factory close to home did everything, it would be expensive. A bureaucracy would need to approve every decision, and its members would need to be paid. Some workers would be hired to mine the aluminum and others to find the rubber. Then others would build the bikes and market them to local stores. However, dividing the tasks evenly between different countries in order to deduct or minimize certain costs makes a lot more sense. Paying for metal mined in Brazil and shaped in the Philippines can save manufacturing costs. Building the bikes in China, where prices are low, and selling them to Japan, where prices are high, can help a business owner make higher profits. The consensus among many traders is that globalization has helped them become wealthy. Globalization, however, has its negative side as well, as local workers sometimes lose out to absent laborers in distant lands. For this reason, many commentators deem globalization as something negative. The ideological differences between supporters of globalization may clash with politicians who pass laws that try to limit it. Yet, despite critiques, globalization continues to grow stronger. United States franchises like McDonald's, for example, can be found around the world, and almost all machines have parts that are made in China.
The helpful Appy. It had not rained on the prairie for several months. Because of the drought, the climate had become very arid. There was no moisture left in the soil. No crops could grow in the dry ground. By winter time, the people had nothing to eat. The hungry families heard about an abbey near the mountains where food and water was still abundant. So they traveled inland across the prairie to the abbey. At first, only a few families arrived, seeking food and shelter. Then there was ample food. The monks fed them and let them sleep in the small cathedral. Soon, however, more families were arriving every day. These people had to travel farther, so they were in worse condition. The rugged journey had brought them to the edge of a crisis. They were cold and tired. The tiny cathedral was soon full. Food became scarce. The monks began to grumble. They began to speculate that there would be no food. "If more families come, we won't make it through the winter," said a young monk. "We must ask some of them to leave." The abbot heard this. "We cannot do that," he said. "It would be wrong to deprive them of food and shelter. We took an oath to help those that need help. All here are in need, so all are eligible to receive our food and shelter." "But we won't have enough," the monk said. "That might be true, but we must help them nonetheless. We will fast," the abbot replied. "Also, we will give our rooms in the abbey to those sleeping outside, and we will sleep in the churchyard that adjoins the cathedral." The monks were reluctant at first, but they did what the oldest monk said. By the end of the winter, there was still enough food and shelter for everyone. They learned that sometimes helping others means you must give more help than you first expected.
Small world. Even though people can't see me, I'm an important part of Earth's biosphere. Scientists who study ecology know that I was the first life form on Earth. There are more of my kind than any other plant or animal in the world. Without me, other plants and animals would not even exist. I am a protist, and my tiny body is made up of one single cell. In my small world, things can be absolutely bizarre. Unlike most aquatic plants and animals, I don't need a temperate climate. I have a very high tolerance for extreme conditions. Right now, I'm swimming around in a bucket of boiling water. The temperature is 150 degrees Celsius, but I feel comfortable. I have coarse hairs, called cilia, that help me swim around in here. I move my cilia in a repetitive motion for the duration of my swim. I cannot go very fast, though. It takes me about 5 minutes to swim a distance of just 1 millimeter. When I get hungry, I look for tiny, vulnerable parasites. I swim up to one and swallow it whole. I digest things much like people do. I have an organ that works just like a human stomach. After I eat, I release nitrogen gas. Nitrogen is a prominent gas in the Earth's atmosphere. Other plants and animals need my nitrogen to survive. My reproductive ability is my most unique trait. I don't need a companion to mate with. Instead, I undergo a process called fission, where my own nucleus splits in half. An exact copy of my nucleus is made, which forms into another protist. It really is an impressive feat. I can create an infinite number of new protists all by myself.
The weaving machine. Mr. Joseph Franklin invented a machine that could weave cloth. It wove faster and straighter than anyone could weave by hand. He decided to take it to 2 cities on a peninsula, Netherton and Wilton. In these cities, a large proportion of the people worked in the weaving industry. Joseph felt sure he could sell his machine there. Joseph first took his machine to the mayor of Netherton. "Think of the money you will earn from this machine," Joseph said to him. But the mayor was a people-oriented man. He knew about the people's dependence on weaving for their livelihood. If he bought the machine, the people would lose their jobs, so he refused to buy it. Joseph said, "We are no longer in the medieval age. Soon everything will be made by machines. Cloth made by hand will soon be obsolete. If you don't change your archaic ways, your town's income will diminish." But the mayor said, "I don't like capitalism. Don't impose your radical ideas on my town. Go away." So Joseph took his machine to the mayor at Wilton. This mayor thought Joseph's machine was spectacular and spent a long time looking at its different components made of brass. The mayor couldn't refute the fact that the machine had drawbacks that would affect the people's jobs. But he realized the machine could bring money and prestige. So he ordered Joseph to build 20 of them. Within a year, Wilton was a wealthy city, famous for its wonderful cloth. People no longer wove, but worked in managerial jobs at cloth factories instead. Nobody bought the cloth from Netherton anymore. The people of Netherton became poor and hungry. Finally, the mayor of Netherton called Joseph and said, "Now I realize that your machine is not just a crazy idea. To succeed in business, we must be willing to change." He then ordered 20 weaving machines. After that, both Netherton and Wilton became rich cities, famous throughout the land for their wonderful cloth.
Life on the farm. Bill was an excellent capitalist. He financed a large aviation enterprise that made a lot of money. He knew how to maximize monetary gains in every business deal he made. Bill had one big problem, though. He was unhappy all the time. Bill knew that he had to do something about it, or he would be depressed for the rest of his life. One day, Bill was in his office when he heard a knock at the door. "Come in," Bill said loudly. His accountant, Jane, walked in. Jane said, "Sir, I haven't seen you smile in a year. What are you so sad about? Your company is doing very well." Bill told her, "I'm indifferent about my company's success. I have contempt toward my job. I just want to do something I enjoy. I've always loved growing plants as a hobby. I'm going to quit my job and become a farmer." "You're crazy," Jane said. "I don't think so," Bill replied. "I want the simplicity of a life on a farm. I'm tired of all this stress. Farming will make me happy." The very next day, Bill carried out the preliminary task of buying land and tools. Then he got to work. He sowed many types of seeds. He planted tomatoes, cabbage, carrots, and onions. "The upcoming summer is going to be very dry," thought Bill. "I need to irrigate my crops as a precaution in case it doesn't rain enough." He took his spade and dug a ditch down the middle of his farm. Water from the stream will flow down the ditch and saturate the soil around every plant, Bill thought. Bill dedicated himself to farming. After a year, his farm was producing very good crops. Most importantly, Bill was happy. He finally had the life he always wanted.
Brothers. John and Mark were brothers, but they were quite different people. Mark looked very masculine. He had a mustache and was very muscular. He was a sculptor. He made things out of stone. Mark was a good artist, but he was not very intelligent. John looked nothing like his brother. He was small and weak, but he was very smart. John was an undergraduate in college, and he studied anthropology and history. He knew a lot about ancient cultures. The brothers loved each other very much, but they thought they had nothing in common. One day, the mayor appointed Mark to build a monument, a statue of Egyptian pharaoh Tut. Mark agreed to do the job, but he had a problem. He had no idea who Pharaoh Tut was. However, he thought he had the competence to build a good statue anyway. He made some crude measurements and sculpted a statue of a very old man with a tattoo on his chest. Mark was proud of his work, but when John saw the statue, he laughed aloud. "What's so funny?" Mark asked. John replied, "Your ignorance makes me laugh. Don't you know that Tut was only a teenager when he was a pharaoh? Let me help you. I'll supervise your work. I'll give you feedback, and we'll make this a great monument." Mark got another cube of stone. John told him what Tut looked like. "Make him tall with good posture," John said, "and make sure there is a symmetry in his body." Mark conferred with John about every detail. For 10 consecutive days, the brothers worked. At last, the finished statue was situated in front of the museum. Everyone applauded the brothers' good work. "We worked together very well. I guess we are compatible after all," Mark said. John replied, "I agree. When we combine our talents, we are capable of greatness."
The Old Hound. Elvis was a dog that loved to run. He possessed all the criteria to be a great racing dog. He had long legs, lean muscles, and a strong heart. He was so good that he never lost a race in the Northern Hemisphere. Spectators who bet on dog races always picked Elvis to win. After 10 years of racing, however, Elvis was getting old. His faculties were not as strong as they used to be. His owner got upset when Elvis started losing. Elvis's owner wasn't a considerate person, and he did not treat Elvis well. Finally, his owner decided to get rid of him. He threw Elvis into his car and took him to the middle of the forest. He tossed him out and drove away. Elvis was cold and scared. He decided to follow a small river into the city. Elvis soon found out that the city was a big and impersonal place. Everywhere he went, he saw signs that said, "No dogs allowed." Pedestrians yelled at him. He was sad, hungry, and alone. He thought that all people were as cruel and uncaring as his owner had been. He was ready to give up when he heard a soft voice say, "What a beautiful hound." Elvis looked up and saw an old woman. She said, "You're entitled to a better life than this. I can take you to a sanctuary for old dogs like you. I'll cater to all your needs. Would you like to come with me?" The woman escorted Elvis to a beautiful facility. There was a sign on the external door that said, "Dogs Welcome." The interior of the building was painted blue, and shiny ornaments hung from the ceiling. There was a heap of tasty bones and bread crusts for consumption. Elvis learned there were kind people in the world after all. He was so thankful that he jumped up and licked the woman's face.
The Big Ship. Ernest looked at his fleet of ships. Usually, he used them for his firm, which imported marble statues from other countries. But today, he was going fishing, and the ship he chose was his favorite. It had an elaborate painting on the side that showed a naval battle. It also had some new updates to its computer system. His favorite ship's latest acquisition was a device with a small grid to show the ship's exact location. This new accessory kept Ernest from getting lost. At daybreak, Ernest happily sailed until he was far from land. Then he saw a small boat in the distance. There was an old man standing next to its mast. He was waving his arms in the air. There was also a boy with his head hanging over the boat's edge. Ernest inferred that the boy was suffering from nausea. Their clothes were saturated with seawater. Ernest assumed that they were in trouble. Most people never realized, but Ernest had an innate desire to help people. He began sailing toward them, eager to facilitate their rescue and thus solve their dilemma. As he got closer to the boat, he was shocked by its simplicity. The boat's wood looked no stronger than cardboard. and the equipment was old. Still, there were several large fish in a pouch in the boat. Ernest threw a large package onto the boat. He yelled, "Here! You can inflate this boat to get you back to land." "Get out of here!" screamed the old man. Ernest was confused. "Don't you need help?" he asked. "Your ship doesn't seem adequate enough to sail so far away from land." "You've just scared away a huge fish," the boy said. "We waved to let you know you were too close to us." Ernest turned around and headed home. He learned that it's better not to help unless asked to. Otherwise, you might not help anyone at all.
I didn't do it. Billy was in big trouble. The day before, a donor had given the school a painting with a sports theme. It showed a referee congratulating two athletes. The principal had hung the painting in front of the office, hoping that it would be a stimulus for students to play sports. The next morning, however, the painting was destroyed. There was graffiti on it, and it had many holes in it. The worst part was that one of Billy's fellow students had said she thought she saw Billy do it. But Billy didn't do it. The principal called Billy's parents and said, "Billy won't tell us the truth. He's a chronic liar and he ruined the painting. If you don't pay for it, we'll terminate his education here." Billy's parents didn't have enough money to pay for the painting and for his tuition. But Billy's parents had an idea. That afternoon, they went to see Mr. Myers, an attorney. "Mr. Myers, my son has been implicated in a crime he says he didn't do," Billy's father said. "Everybody believes the gossip. Even some of our own kin think he did it." "I believe you. My suspicion is that the tape from the security cameras will show who really did it," said Mr. Myers. The next day, Mr. Myers received a packet with a videotape from the school. It showed another student who resembled Billy walking up to the painting and writing on it. Then the student took a knife by the shaft and started to stab large holes in it. Finally, he severed the rope that held up the painting, and it fell to the floor. Mr. Myers showed the tape to the principal. "Clearly, that's not Billy," he said. "This boy is actually responsible and needs some discipline." Billy was happy that someone believed him. He said to Mr. Myers, "When I graduate and go to university, I will major in law so I can be a guardian of justice like you."
A soldier's decision. A soldier was captured while fighting in an enemy king's land. It was well known that this king would make captives fight one another. This was commonplace during his reign. For these fights, the king had built several large arenas. He often awarded the winners by setting them free or even having them join his elite army corps. The soldier, however, decided he had seen too much violence. He now felt that all life was sacred. The night before his first match, he made a risky decision. He decided that he would not engage in combat. He knew he might never be set free, but it was a decision that he was willing to accept. In the morning, he was led from the prisoner's compound to one of the king's arenas. A gate coated in rust stood between him and the floor of the auditorium. He was worried, but he knew what he had to do. When the gate opened, he calmly walked to the center of the arena and sat. He started to meditate. His foe, Darius, who was skilled in the realm of sword fighting and was typically not very aggressive, would not fight the quiet soldier until he attacked Darius first. Darius tried to provoke him by hacking at the air close to his head with his sword. But the soldier was not distracted. He sat quietly, as if he were dumb, and looked calmly up at the sky. Even when Darius nicked him on the cheek with the edge of his sword, the soldier did not move. At last, he threw down his sword and shield and gave up. "I can't fight someone who refuses to fight me." Darius shouted to the king. The king was very impressed with the soldier. Never in any battle had he seen someone so brave. As a result, he gave the peaceful soldier amnesty. The soldier's actions proved to the king and everyone in the arena that peace was more powerful than fighting.
The Man and the Monkey. While flying over a jungle, a wealthy executive's private plane crashed. Some of the crew were hurt, so the pilot decided to stay with them and wait for help. The arrogant executive, though, didn't care about the welfare of the pilot and crew. Rather, he thought he could walk out of the jungle and find a town to stay in. He followed a trail through a canyon and along a creek. The jungle was actually very stunning. If the arrogant executive had stopped to look around, he might have perceived the jungle's beauty. But he was in a nasty mood and had no care for the aesthetic value of the jungle. He continued to walk up the steep incline of the jungle's hills. Soon he was lost. Several days passed, and fatigue and hunger weakened him. He was very tired and afraid. Just then, a monkey came out of the trees. It was carrying a twig covered in honey. It walked up to a mound where termites lived. He then used the twig like a drill to make a hole in the mound. Then, very carefully, it removed the twig from the hole. The sticky twig was covered with termites. Instead of eating the bugs, the monkey offered them to the executive. But he didn't want what the monkey offered. He shouted at the monkey, "Get away from me, you stupid primate!" The executive's stereotype of the monkey was wrong. The monkey was not stupid. It knew how to find food, whereas the executive did not. He refused the help of the monkey, thereby leaving himself to starve. When the executive was finally found, he was very skinny and sick. He had not eaten for a very long time. Because he held a bias against the primitive ways of the monkey, he had gone hungry and almost died. The executive didn't understand that it was his arrogant attitude that had caused all of his problems.
Cosmo's flight. When Cosmo woke up, he was crying. He had had a dream that he was falling. This dream had recurred for the previous 5 nights. Cosmo was scared that his dreams were a preview of what was going to happen on his flight the next day. Cosmo was a supernatural being who was about to turn 15 years old. In his culture, boys of his age were required to participate in an important rite. They were given wings and instructed to orbit the Earth. After successful flights, the boys officially became man. Cosmo certainly wanted to be a man, but he was scared. He went to the oracle of a god named Dano. Cosmo said, "I'm not sure I can make such a long trip. What if I get tired? What if my strength stalls and I can't stay in the air? I'll crash and die." Dano replied, "Don't be afraid. You have all the relevant skills in your personal inventory that have been building up over the years. To ease your worry, let me tell you a little about what will happen tomorrow. You'll begin over Africa. You'll keep flying north until you come to the Himalayas. The mountaintops will look like small loaves of bread at such a high distance. The rivers of the world will look like pieces of blue string that cross the globe. Keep your body horizontal when flying against the winds of the Pacific Ocean. Keep your eyes open and enjoy the beauty of the earth. You will be fine. You'll see." Cosmo replied, "Thanks for the overview of my journey. I'll do my best." The next morning, Cosmo was provided with a divine set of wings and sent on his way. He flapped his wings and went high above the earth. He flew over mountains, oceans, and glaciers. After a while, his inward thoughts were no longer about falling. He was actually having fun. He began to hum a song as he enjoyed the view. When he reached home, his tribe was there to greet him. The chief said, "On behalf of the tribe, I declare you a man. We're proud of you, Cosmo." Cosmo was proud of himself, too.
The lottery. Joe was watching television when he heard a knock at the door. He thought, "Who could that be? It's probably one of the naughty neighborhood children." Joe stood up and walked to the door. When he opened it, he saw a beautiful woman. She said, "Good morning, Joe. I have great news. You're the recipient of this check for $1 million. You won the lottery." Joe couldn't believe it. His mind was overloaded with emotions. Joe said, "Thank you, thank you." After he calmed down, Joe made a photocopy of the check in case he misplaced the original one. He sat and thought about what he wanted to do with the money. He didn't want to spend it in an arbitrary way. Joe thought, "I know there are others who need this money more than I do. I've always loved animals, so I think I'll buy things for the zoo." Joe knew that the zoo was in bad shape. The cages were too small, and they weren't insulated from the cold. Animals couldn't thrive in such conditions. He took out some stationery and wrote a letter to the zoo. He offered to help the zoo buy huge cages for the large mammals and reptiles. He offered to buy healthy food for the orangutans to increase their longevity. He even said that he would buy new glass walls for the aquarium because the old ones were cracked. Joe's act of philanthropy intrigued the zookeeper. He decided to probe into Joe's motivations to learn why he spent his money to improve the zoo. It wasn't a social convention for a person to be so gracious. Joe told the zookeeper, "I know it's not the norm, but my ultimate decision to help these animals is better than anything I could have done for myself. If I ever write an autobiography, I will write that this was the happiest day of my life."
Jen's new job. The History Museum needed to recruit a new tour guide. The director interviewed dozens of applicants before he decided to hire Jen. She was chosen because she was friendly, punctual, and had a great attitude. On her first day, Jen got to work and prepared to give her first tour. She looked at the names on the register. She saw that the Queen of England and a diplomat were visiting the museum. She thought, "It's my very first day, and I have to impress a monarch? I hope I don't humiliate myself in front of a person of such renown." Jen was nervous. She took a deep breath and said, "Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about the chronology of ancient Egypt." As she turned around to show the group some artifacts, she bumped into a copy of a fossil of an authentic elephant tusk. It fell to the ground and broke into 1,000,000 pieces. "Oh, no," said Jen to herself. "I sure hope the rest of the tour goes better than this." The rest of the tour did not go any better. She tripped over an antique vase and broke a piece off of it. As she was reading an excerpt from a lyric poem, she sneezed and tore a page of the epic. After the tour, Jen approached the Queen to apologize. She said, "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I was a terrible tour guide. Let me give you a refund for the money you spent." The Queen laughed and said, "I didn't pay, so there is no need for a refund, Jen. I love the tour. You just have to be a little more careful and work hard to become the best at your job. Hard work precedes success." Jen smiled and thanked the Queen. she decided to be extra careful from then on. She was persistent and worked hard. In time, Jen became the best tour guide at the museum.
The Fossil Hunters. Tim and Dean were great fossil hunters. They were the very best at finding dinosaur bones. Although Tim and Dean were quite similar, they were outright enemies. The two men got into vicious arguments all the time. They couldn't coexist peacefully because their egos were too large. Tim thought he was the best fossil hunter, while Dean was sure that he was much better than Tim. One day, Tim was searching for fossils on the periphery of the city when he stumbled on a huge thigh bone. He had never seen anything like it. He took his shovel and carefully excavated the dirt around it. As he dug, he uncovered more jagged bones. He realized that he had found an entire dinosaur skeleton. Tim couldn't conceive of the magnitude of the find. He could not think of a plan to remove the huge skeleton all by himself. Such an endeavor would be beyond his capability. He needed help. He tried to think of people who would be capable of helping him remove the skeleton without breaking it. The only person Tim could think of was Dean, his enemy. Tim ran into the city to find Dean. Tim found him and said, "Dean, I found the skeletal remains of a huge animal, but I can't get the skeleton out by myself. Will you please help me?" Dean thought that Tim's claim might be dubious. He replied, "If you're serious about the skeleton, I'll help." Tim excitedly showed Dean the skeleton's locale. They worked together to carefully remove each bone. To keep the bones together, they tied them with elastic strips. When they were finished, they had uncovered a perfect skeleton. They used plaster to make a mold of the dinosaur's skull. They engraved their initials into it and gave it to the curator of a local museum. Tim and Dean found out that they could work very well together. They decided to end their feud and become friends. By combining their talents, the men became even greater than they were before.
The Butler's Bad Day. The superintendent of civic projects was a busy man. He worked every day of the week and had glamorous parties at his house every night. However, if there was someone busier than him, it was his butler. He worked all day organizing the superintendent's parties and then cleaned up after them late at night. Hence, while the superintendent slept soundly, snoring loudly in his bed, the butler was still awake. Sadly, although the butler was always overworked, his profession's intrinsic nature demanded he never be outspoken. Therefore, his employer never knew the butler hadn't slept for several days. On any day, the butler might make a mistake. One day, the superintendent said, "This particular party is important. People from the ministry are coming. Everything must be perfect." The butler began preparing at once. First, he went to the attic to get more chairs and tables. But on his descent, he realized he needed to make the food. A gourmet dinner was necessary for such a party. He boiled water in a kettle for soup and chopped some beef into chunks. Just as he was starting the soup, he remembered that he had to sweep the veranda. As he was sweeping it, he realized that he had to clean the sauna. By this time, the first guests had arrived. The veranda was still dirty. There were not enough chairs for the guests to sit on, and the soup was tasteless. Some guests were dissatisfied. They started to make a fuss, and the party was filled with a din of complaints. The superintendent's party was a disaster. He wondered why his butler had made so many mistakes. At last, the butler admitted to being exhausted. His boss felt pity for the butler. He had no idea the butler was so tired. He said, "You should have told me earlier, and then we could have avoided this whole ordeal."
Watch out! Kevin stepped off the tram and walked toward the ship, holding a package tightly in his hands. He had been hired as a courier for an important broker. All he needed to do was deliver a package to an office in New York City. The ship would take him there. When he boarded, the ship was congested with people. As Kevin walked to his cabin, he saw the exclusive first-class section. Everybody inside was wearing fancy garments. He would have liked to socialize with the people inside, but it was against proper etiquette. People paid a premium for the privilege to ride in first class. Instead, he went to his cabin next to the freight section of the boat. His room smelled bad, and the floorboards were warped and deformed in some areas. He could also hear the motor humming as it waited to propel the ship forward. Suddenly, Kevin was unsettled by something, but he wasn't sure why. He took a short walk on the ship's deck, but he still felt strange. That night, he suffered from insomnia. He couldn't suppress his obsessing over how strange he felt. Kevin went back on deck. It was cold and dark outside. He looked overboard, but it seemed that everything was all right. Just go back inside, he thought. Then Kevin saw it. A giant iceberg was sticking out of the ocean in the distance. "Help!" he yelled. People looked at him as if he was crazy, but he continued to shout until he saw the captain. "There's an iceberg out there," Kevin said to him. "If the ship doesn't move, we're liable to crash," he said, pointing toward the iceberg. The captain saw it and immediately instructed the crew to change the ship's direction. "Without your help, we would have definitely hit the iceberg. That would have been a terrible disaster," he said to Kevin. Kevin felt relieved. Now he knew to always trust his intuitive sense.
The avalanche. Randy was a forest ranger. Because of his job, he was often secluded in a cabin in the wilderness. One day, the radio reported, "A change in the atmosphere is causing a lot of clouds to form. A serious storm." Suddenly, the radio went silent. The signal was lost. He went outside and looked at the overcast sky. Anybody else would have taken the dark sky as an omen of a very bad storm, but not Randy. His upbringing had taught him consistency. He had done this job for years, and nothing could stop him. Besides, he thought nothing could hurt him. Today, he had a very important task to do. The snow was starting to pile up high on the mountain. If too much accumulated, it could cause an avalanche. But Randy had an apparatus to get rid of the snow. It used dynamite to shake the snow and make the top layer of snow come down. As the snow started falling, he thought about returning to the office until the storm stopped, but he decided not to. Suddenly, he heard a loud noise behind him. It was an avalanche. He started to run, but within seconds, he was knocked sideways and buried by the snow and rubble from an old cabin that had been destroyed. An aerial rescue team came quickly. Randy was just a speck amongst the great pile of snow. But the team found him thanks to his brightly colored jacket. They quickly took him to a hospital. After a few hours, Randy woke up in the hospital. He looked at the sober faces of the doctors and saw his wife sobbing. "What's wrong?" he asked. He didn't remember what had happened. "You were almost killed," his wife said. You broke several ribs, but the rest of you is still reasonably intact. You are really lucky to be alive," the doctor said. After 5 days, Randy was discharged from the hospital. The episode had taught him a poignant lesson. He was a mortal, and nature was much more powerful than him.
The Butler. Greta was an elderly lady who lived alone in a huge, dilapidated mansion. The mansion was in terrible condition. It was covered with filth, and most of the furniture was broken. Plus, the kitchen sink leaked water all over the floor. Greta was too old to do housekeeping and repairs herself, so she hired a butler named Gordon. Gordon was a young, muscular man. His muscles were a testament to his strong work ethic. He believed that if he worked hard, great things would happen for him. On his first day, he worked for hours, cleaning and making repairs. He swept up mounds of dirt. He tightened the valve underneath the kitchen faucet to stop the leak. He even bought timber to build new stools for the kitchen. He worked so hard that his fingers went numb and he got cramps in his shoulders. Gordon worked hard every day. Even when tasks were boring, he was never reckless. He made sure there were no flaws in his work. Gordon was worried, however, that Greta wasn't pleased. She never expressed thanks or said that he did a good job. The lack of appreciation evoked unhappy feelings in Gordon. He even thought about quitting. But he decided the right thing to do was to keep working hard. One day, while Gordon was sweeping, Greta said, "Gordon, I have a surprise for you." He went to Greta's room and saw a beautiful slate statue. It looked just like him. It was decorated with a banner that read, "Welcome home." Greta said, "You've made this ugly old mansion look new again. I'm so thankful for your hard work that I want you to have it. I'll move into a smaller house." He grinned and gave Greta a big hug. He said, "What bliss! My hard work really paid off." The two said their farewells, and Gordon spent the afternoon admiring his beautiful new home.
The Coward's Lesson. Tom was easily frightened. He enlisted in the army because he thought the military would teach him courage. And although he needed courage, he never imagined how he would learn it. During a march across a tract of wilderness to practice guerrilla warfare near his country's frontier, Tom strayed from his squad. He had stopped to gaze at a splendid view of a lush valley. When he turned around, his squad was gone. He searched for them, but because their outfits had camouflage, he couldn't find them. It was getting dark, and Tom grew weary. All he had was a knife and his handbook. He made camp for the night. It was cold, and the ground was hard. He wished he had his cot and a blanket. Instead, he made a fire, wrapped himself tightly in his jacket, and fell asleep. A loud noise roused him from his sleep. What was that? He wondered. Then he noticed it. An animal of substantial size had left a print from its paw in the dirt. He sat closer to the fire and looked into the darkness. He imagined a large beast jumping from the gloom and attacking him. He shook with fear. Tom contemplated many different plans. He was hesitant to act. He decided to stay by the fire, but during his vigil, he heard more noises. He couldn't contend with his fear any longer. He knew what he had to do. He made a torch and followed the prints. He heard a twig snap very close ahead, but he bravely went on. Seconds later, he discovered what had scared him. It was only a sheep. Tom went back to his camp and slept. In the morning, he found his squad. He had finally learned courage. He learned that he had to confront his fear in order to conquer it.
The Brute and the Billionaire. Hundreds of people had come to see a popular satire, but during the performance, a fire started in the theater. The audience and actors evacuated the building. Luckily, no one was hurt, and the fire was soon put out. Immediately, the audience assembled into an angry mob and demanded to know what had happened. It was soon revealed that the fire had started backstage, and only 2 people were in the area at the time. One was the husband of the play's star actress, the billionaire Henry Rich. The other was the theater's janitor, Bill, a large and strong man who looked like a brute. The crowd segregated the 2 men and demanded to know who the culprit was. Most of the crowd thought that Bill was to blame. They felt that he had started the fire, without ever subjecting him to any scrutiny. Bill resented this, but said nothing. Luckily, the billionaire's wife testified in his defense. "Your decision is premature," she told the crowd. "I fell down amid the tumult while everyone fled the fire. Bill rescued me and carried me out of the building. I think you underestimate his character. Besides, in order to be close enough to save me, he couldn't have been near the place where the fire began." The crowd then turned their eyes to the billionaire. "He did it," they shouted. "Make him pay." "Wait," the billionaire said over the uproar. "I admit that I started the fire, but it was an accident. I was going backstage to see my wife and was clumsy. I collided with a lamp, and it fell to the floor. It fell into some flammable clothing, a fire started, and I fled." The mob was surprised. The man they blamed was innocent, and the billionaire was guilty. To pay for his error, the billionaire not only repaired the theater, but had it remade to be better than before.
The Persistent Inventor. A young student of meteorology was having a difficult time with an experiment. He was attempting to duplicate lightning in clouds. He had made a device that could simulate lightning. It worked by releasing an electromagnetic pulse into the cloud. This pulse, in turn, stimulated the electrons in the cloud's particles. Then, the electrons produced lightning. But his meteorological experiment had a major defect. He couldn't get the device into the sky. He had tied it to balloons, but they had burst. He had shot the device from a cannon, but the force of the cannon had damaged it. "You should give up," his friends told him. "You'll never get that thing into the air." But his friends' criticisms only spurred him to try again. The student was very innovative, and at last, he thought he had an innovation that would work. He attached wings to the device, and on one dreary day, when clouds blocked the light of the sun, he started his experiment anew. He placed the device on a rocket and launched it into the sky. The propulsion of the rocket carried the device high into the air. The rocket accelerated into the clouds and then released the device. It glided on its wings through the clouds, and when it penetrated the center of a large black cloud, it emitted the electromagnetic pulse. And just as he had predicted, lightning shot from the cloud. He called his professors, and the next day they came to watch. He successfully duplicated the experiment. His teachers were extremely impressed and called the student and his invention ingenious. The student was given many awards and became a famous inventor. He had not given up. He had remained persistent and succeeded.
The Nurse's Lesson. One of the children in the nursery was sick. The child's mother, who usually chattered constantly, was quiet and worried. She knew that if she did not act quickly, the child's condition would deteriorate. She summoned the children's nurse and said to her, "The monks made a medicine that can cure my child's sickness. Please hurry tonight to the monastery and get it." The nurse immediately hurried from the manor to get the medicine. The monastery was far away, and she had to walk along a dark and winding trail. The temperature was close to 0 degrees centigrade, and it was raining. Luckily, the nurse had grabbed her raincoat beforehand. She zipped it up and pulled the hood over her head. "I'll never make it there," she thought. "Perhaps I should return and go in the morning." But she remembered the sick child and decided to continue. She could see the gleam of a light in the distance, and finally she arrived at the monastery. It was very late. She feared the monks would not be hospitable. But she approached the door and knocked anyway. The rain had condensed on the exterior of the windows by the door. All she could see was the blurred profile of a large man coming to answer the door. Again, she was filled with fear. But the monk smiled at her with good humor when he opened the door. He took her outstretched hand and welcomed her with a hearty voice. The place was warm, and she heard a concerto playing in another room. She relaxed. "How can I help you?" the monk asked, and the nurse explained the situation. He instantly knew what to do. He grabbed a parcel of medicine and took her back to the manor in a carriage. The medicine worked. The nurse was happy she had kept going through the bad weather and found the monastery. Now the boy would be able to get better, and the mother would be happy again.
The Mayor of Sherman. The cosmopolitan city of Sherman needed to elect a new mayor. 2 men aspired to become mayor, Mr. Jones and Mr. Webb. Mr. Jones was a tall, handsome man. He was a phenomenal speaker, and the citizens loved him. However, Mr. Jones didn't know much about running a city. He was a pathological liar who merely flattered people with his words. Mr. Webb was very different. He was a small, unattractive man. He was lame and limped when he walked. But he was an expert in politics and knew what was best for the people. The citizens of Sherman didn't care about what the politicians had to say. No one listened to Mr. Webb, even though he had great ideas. They cheered when Mr. Jones spoke, although he didn't talk about important things. It was as if his pretty words put people in a trance. All the polls predicted that Mr. Jones would win the election. When the votes were totaled, Mr. Jones won easily. But when he took office, he didn't know what to do. He tried to hide his ignorance by working in secrecy. He added a law to the city's constitution that prevented citizens from seeing the mayor. He even censored newspapers that tried to disseminate information about his inability to help the people. Soon, however, Mr. Jones became infamous for his poor leadership. There was an outburst of anger among the citizens. They were full of remorse for their misguided decision to elect an ignorant mayor. They voted to remove Mr. Jones and let Mr. Webb take over. Immediately, Mr. Webb proved that he was a great mayor. He abolished Mr. Jones's law, and he was willing to talk openly with everyone. He tackled important issues and amended unfair laws in the city's charter. The citizens learned that a pleasant appearance and nice words do not make a good leader. The most important qualities are intelligence and a desire to help others.
The Editor's Choice. A newspaper editor sat at his desk and stared at the flashing cursor on his computer screen. He didn't know if he should delete the article he had just written or go ahead and publish it. He was scared and filled with doubt. The empire had passed a new law stating that citizens could only use the imperial language. The editor disagreed with the law and decided to write an article about why it was wrong. He felt that the new law excluded people of different nationalities and racial and ethnic backgrounds. He had first-hand knowledge of what it felt like not to be fluent in the imperial language, because he was from a remote part of the empire. He felt that the empire shouldn't be monolingual and should be more inclusive, yet he was afraid that he would get in trouble for having this belief. Many would say that he was not a patriot, that he didn't love the empire. But he didn't wish to undermine the authority of the empire. He wanted to argue that the empire could be stronger if it accepted people of various cultures and beliefs. At last, he decided to stop being a coward and to be earnest about how he felt. He wrote the article. It wasn't rude or angry, but rather very solemn and intelligent. The next day, it was published in all the papers. Everyone was impressed by his tact and showed solidarity with his ideas. He expected to be arrested any day, but the police never came. Surprisingly, instead of being prosecuted, he became a hero. The legislature changed the law, and people from many linguistic backgrounds praised him. "Never be afraid to be vocal," the editor later wrote. "If you think something is wrong, then stand up for what you believe."
The kidnapping. Anne was a very quiet girl who had an inherent fear of almost everything. The kids at school would play tricks on her all the time. They would hide behind the door of the school janitor's closet, then jump out to scare her. Once, a boy dressed up like a vampire and chased her down the street. Anne hated being constrained by her fears, but she didn't know how to be brave. She was walking home from school one day when someone came up behind her. Before she could turn around, a powerful man grabbed her. She couldn't scream because a huge hand was put over her mouth. Anne knew that this could not be another stunt by her classmates. The scary man restrained her arms and legs and carried her to his house. He tied Anne to a chair. Her guts began to hurt because she was so scared. The man prodded Anne with his forefinger and said, "You'll stay right here until I get a ransom from your parents. Then I'll be rich." The dirty man spit when he talked. A string of saliva hung from his moist lips. Anne was terrified and intimidated by the horrible man. But she knew she had to escape somehow. Eventually, the man yawned. Anne waited quietly until he fell asleep. As he slept, she carefully wiggled her arms and legs until the ropes became loose. She slipped out of the ropes and carefully opened the door. She sprinted to the bus depot and boarded a bus to the police station. She told the police what happened, and they arrested the kidnapper. The kids at school were amazed. They asked her, "Weren't you too scared to escape?" She said, "Nope, I knew that I had to be brave and get out of there." The kids were very tolerant of Anne from then on. They even decided that they would emulate her bravery if they ever got into a tough situation.
The Lord and the Farmers. A wealthy lord was renovating his mansion. He had added another story to his home with large windows that overlooked the farmers' pastures on the eastern border of his land. Around the mansion, he then erected a great wall. He built an arch for the gate out of huge slabs of stone. The Lord was overjoyed with the addition to his home. However, one day while he was sitting on the terrace, some farmers knocked at his door. He invited them in. Despite his hospitality, the farmers appeared to be in a foul mood. "Why are you so upset?" the Lord asked. One farmer replied, "That is actually the reason for our visit." He then handed the Lord a petition. It alleged that the shadow cast by the mansion was harming their pastures. "Your mansion now casts a shadow over several hectares of our land," the farmer explained. "The turf in the shadow has died, and our cattle now have less grass to eat." "It is too late for me to revise my plans," the Lord answered. "You will just have to live with the change." His reply only heightened the farmers' anger. They left, but they assembled that night outside the mansion's gate. They planned to destroy the mansion. The Lord's servants tried to defend the house, but the farmers outnumbered them. The servants fled, and the farmers rushed into the mansion and set it on fire. Everyone got out of the house, and there were no casualties. However, the fire soon spread from the house to the adjoining pastures that belonged to the farmers. Both sides' properties were destroyed. The Lord and the farmers were sorry for their actions. The Lord promised to pay for the burned pastures, and the farmers promised to rebuild the mansion. They had learned that when you fight, both sides lose.
The shortcut. A truck driver was driving cargo from the outback to the coast. His load was comprised of many types of ore. He needed a huge truck to carry its bulk to a ship waiting at a pier on the country's eastern coast. At the border between two counties, he'd have to pay a tariff on the cargo. However, he could keep his money if he avoided the station at the border. He worried about getting in trouble for not paying the tariff, but the thought of not having to spend the money outweighed this concern. He took out his road map. To his surprise, it depicted a small road that had a dual advantage. It not only avoided the border station, but also was a shorter route to the coast. He decided to take the shortcut. However, along his journey, he soon ran into problems. First, he had to cross a small wooden bridge. His truck weighed too much for the bridge. It was analogous to an elephant trying to stand on a tree branch. The bridge started to break as the truck crossed, and the trailer tilted to the right. Fortunately, the truck made it safely across, but most of the ore fell into the river below. Next, it was a very hot day. The thermometer read over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The truck's engine became too hot, so the driver parked it in the shade of a grove of trees until it cooled down. Later, he took a wrong turn. He stopped and took out his binoculars. He scanned his surroundings and eventually discovered a landmark that led him back to the proper route. Finally, he arrived at the pier, but the ship wasn't there. When he asked about the ship's whereabouts, a man said that it had left 30 minutes earlier. He had not fulfilled his contract. He realized then the paradox of the shortcut. The shortest route can be the longest, and vice versa. A long route may be the fastest.